talk,
identity,
and access
management.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How's it going?
I'm pretty good. And yourself?
Good. I've got good and bad news, but it's the same news. So
it's not going to be a HIPAA violation, I hope.
It's not. I'm not going to talk about my health today, but it's so often when we record the podcast, it's a Thursday afternoon, and my landscapers show up right before we start recording. They did not show up this week, so that's good news. But it's also bad news because I'm not sure if I'm getting my yard mowed today, and my neighbors may not appreciate that.
Yet another first world problem here in the land of Identity at the Center podcast. I hope people out there really feel the struggle that you're experiencing.
Hey, I know how fortunate I am to have these first world problems. Absolutely.
I got to tell you, I'm pretty excited for today's show because we have an awesome guest, and I don't want to wait too long to bring him on. We've got Phil Dunkelberger, who is the president and chief executive officer at Nok Nok Labs, and just want to welcome you to the show. Thanks for joining us, Phil.
It's great to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you folks today.
Thanks for joining us. And I should also mention that we may be graced with an appearance by Peanut the cat, right? Maybe she might join us at some point here. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, that will be an interesting interlude if she does.
Probably the most interesting thing that'll happen on the show, maybe of all time. So I think most people would rather just hear dogs and cats at some point than going on and on about identity and access management. But that's what we're going to talk about today is identity and access management, because that's what we do. But before we get to that, I was looking through kind of your background on LinkedIn and some of the conversations that that we've had prior to clicking the record button, and there was a line item there that really sparked interest for Jim and I that we kind of got into a conversation ahead of time, is around your conservation efforts and the work that you do with the Game Rangers Association of Africa, which sounds amazing. And I'd love it if you could just kind of explain what that is, to the audience here, and we can kind of go from there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's a thing that I, on business trip down there, went on safari. And most of the people that think of Africa and think of going on safari get really excited about seeing the animals. And you don't really realize, kind of like going to Disneyland, what goes on behind the scenes and what it really takes and the effect that those efforts have. And the animals are one part of an ecosystem that includes the local people, their culture, how they've grown up over centuries of dealing with animals in their midst. And it's really an interesting piece that the Game Rangers are kind of the last guys standing. And we're on a project right now that we call the Soul of a Ranger. And what does it take to really be a protector of ecosystems in the African continent in this day and age with all of the upheaval and things going on? And I've been really privileged to learn not only about the work they do, and they're really the last guys standing on the wall and gals standing on the wall that keep the ecosystems going. And there's a ton of good work, and if people are interested, they can go, and I'll be glad to supply you guys through your site and your podcast with some information. But it's really worthwhile work because they create jobs, they help the local community, they help build schools. They do a lot more than just do what we in at least North America look at our Rangers as. They're not just a policing function. So thank you for that. And I've really been privileged to be a part of it.
That's fantastic. And definitely, we'll put links to, how you can get more information around that into the show notes so people can kind of check that out. And I know that's something that you've been passionate about. It's fantastic. I think, speaking on behalf of Jim and I, we're happy to help promote it and, try to get interest out there and help drive awareness towards it because it's important stuff. From a identity and access management perspective, since that's really kind of why we're here, you've been in the business for a very long time, not to put an age on it or anything, but maybe you can talk about some of your experiences in the past and kind of what's brought you to where you are today.
Yeah, going back in my career, the identity and access management piece has always played a key role. I started my career in tech with Xerox when they were trying to introduce this concept of Ethernet, and most of your listeners will laugh at that, or the idea of mice interface and Windows interface on the Xerox Star Workstation and Ethernet server configurations we had. And so I go back a long ways. This is my 40th year in the industry. And so I am an old guy, and I've seen where a lot of the quote unquote things that have happened and challenges that have taken place. And at the center of it always has been is this concept of users and data and access control. Where's the data stored and who has access to it was at the very beginning of my career. And then over time in my jobs, specifically most recently as the CEO of PGP, there were many times when people would talk about using, for instance, PGP keys as an identifier, something and something you have in the traditional parlance. And that was something that was always center to my background in computing. So it's been a long journey. I've enjoyed it. I've certainly learned a lot and been challenged a lot. But identity, who you are, what you have, and what you have access to has always been a critical part of my background.
Yeah, Phil, it sounds like, you've been kind of, what I took from that was, very early on the multi-factor authentication side, something you have is something really cool. And I know you were involved in the very early days of FIDO2, PGP and FIDO2. What were some of the early drivers that helped bring that along?
Well, if you go, great ask about both of those. FIDO, as a consequence, there's FIDO, the group, and then there's FIDO components, FIDO different parts, and we'll talk about that. Hopefully, I know you've done a great show on that recently. But the real key here in my background was some of the drivers have always been early on. If you were in a mainframe environment and there was somebody worrying about the identity on a terminal, how you'd resolve that is turn the terminal off. And then you'd go and resolve was the person on the terminal had the right to be there. And it used the convention of a username and password. And on the back end, very much like today, a set of signals that people would look at to say, is this really the right user of that terminal? Well, as systems exploded into the whole now, to the nth degree that we've exploded the infrastructure, and it's not centralized anymore. Many of the ideas that we had about identity and access controls are still baked in that mainframe era. We're still using a convenience that's 50, 60 years old when it comes to passwords as an identifier. We're still using the endpoint like a terminal. Hey, I know a lot about somebody's phone or somebody's PC, but I still don't have a clear, is it Phil Dunkelberger on Phil's devices today? So all the way through the identity process that I went through in PGP1 when we were working with Kim Cameron and Zoomit, that was eventually acquired by Microsoft, and Kim's early work on identity. How do you know it's, who's really there? Through things like first time good. When I do an email to you and you email me back, I've never met you, but I assume it's you because you answered the email. A lot of these conventions that are out there from an identity and access capability are really old. And they're really, really, I think, stopping us from advancing some of the really neat things we can do if we think differently about identity and access management going forward.
Yeah, passwordless authentication is kind of like the hot thing right now, right? Where I think organizations are trying to get onto that train somehow. And I think it's going to be a little while still before it becomes something more prevalent. I think it's actually made more inroads in the consumer market. If you think about mobile phones and things like Face ID, Touch ID, PIN patterns, things like that to unlock your device where you're not actually having to enter in this, password of whatever length it may be other than maybe a PIN. Why should people care about that type of approach when it comes to, let's say the enterprise use cases and the work that has been done to enable technology through standards like FIDO2 and set the business up for success when it comes to putting that in place?
Well, you're back to your point about why should people care. So if you look at the evolution and even the comments you just made about consumer use versus enterprise use versus partner portals. Okay, those are three pretty well-known things out there to your audience. Fundamentally, we tend to think about those things differently when in reality, today they're just people with devices looking for services. And the fact of the matter is, architecturally, everything has to authenticate. So instead of starting on the thing that, how do we eat that elephant? Back to my, being in the game Rangers mode, right? How do we eat that elephant? We've been eating it a bite at a time, and I would argue we've been eating it in different layered Band-Aid approaches. the whole idea of what we tried to do with identity and access management when it is regarding to FIDO is starting with everything has to authenticate. But today we really stopped that convenience or that conveyance out to users as who they are when we don't really know who they are. We just know mainly who their devices are. And then through a lot of algorithms and signal processing on the back end, we try to establish identity. And that is really how consumers work. Whereas inside a firewall, where I can control if that perimeter even exists, we could argue that for hours. Inside a firewall with my employees, I've got a much better handle on them. At least I did when they worked in a building, that I could do location work as an algorithmic aspect, or what kind of device, because I had a approved set of devices that could come on and off my network. I don't have that control in a partner environment nor in a consumer environment. And yet today with COVID, one of the leading CIOs in America just said, we're probably going to start having to treat all of our employees and everybody else as customers or as people with devices looking for services. And that's really, I think, the think differently about it, because in trying to segment those populations, we have built a lot of artificial things and a lot of walled gardens that then have to be torn down and rebuilt every time we want to advance the ball down the field.
Yeah, Phil, sorry for laughing while you're talking. I saw the irony in you using the eat the elephant analogy, given your conservation background, but fantastic. One thing that I wanted to ask was, I know you're working with organizations globally with your passwordless authentication solutions. And, to me, kind of what jumps out with passwordless is an obvious ROI that you can move the ball forward from a security standpoint and at the same time improve the user experience. And we always kind of think of, as we up security, we lower the user experience and vice versa. At least that's kind of the paradigm that I think we've all kind of grown up believing. But I think passwordless is actually an opportunity to move the ball forward on both fronts. What I see a lot, though, is that from you eventually got to convince the person who controls the purse strings in terms of making an investment, spending some money on a security initiative. And so you're working with companies all over the globe. You're seeing how they're making that return on investment business case. And I just wanted to throw it back to you. What are you seeing as kind of some of the key messaging and how organizations are making that ROI case?
Well, I think that you bring in two of what we call the four pillars of the FIDO design. Nok Nok Labs, the founder of the FIDO movement and the guy that founded the company was a guy that is big in this whole space for Ramesh Kanasapali. And he's working on sovereign ID now and some other things along with still working with us. But the idea was, when we did the protocol and built the FIDO handshake protocol, it was trying to do four things. First, it was reduce cost of deploying strong authentication, strong multi-factor authentication, build a plug and play construct that you could put this in on existing systems and plug and play. So reduce the cost of security. Second was enhance the security. So the secret to FIDO is public-private key pair challenges. We no longer are using SMS, one-time passwords, other types of conveniences. We're using the strongest thing as a baseline that we know how to do. We never take any of your data and store it on the server. We never take your keys or credentials. We stop phishing, credential stuffing, and those things by design. And some of the biggest, best security teams in the world helped us work on that part of the protocol. So better cost control, absolutely positively, the ability to do better security. But the really critical piece is, if I make things easier to use, I make things that aren't complicated to use. I add something like getting rid of 14 characters, upper lowercase of usernames and passwords. And I move to something like a biometric, a behavioral biometric, any number of endpoints things that I can now do technically sensor-wise. Then I've got a better user experience. And better user experience, better customer satisfaction is a business benefit. Not just from a security and regulatory standpoint, but now truly a business benefit of people using the tool set. And then last but not least, you've got privacy and regulatory compliance in almost every regulated business globally. How do I meet the regulatory and compliance overhang that is out there? How do I meet PSD2 and GDPR and the other gobbledygook of things in highly regulated industries I've got to meet without causing more pain? And that was the goal. Could we do something with the invention of this protocol, plug and play strong auth, that would enhance and make those things possible?
I think the possibility of some of those new methods you talked about are, relatively recent, considering kind of where things used to be. Things like biometrics were not cheap, and proliferating through the enterprise, even in the consumer space, those sorts of things. I'm curious, as you went through this process, are there major differences between the old way, maybe old methods or old solutions? Are there solutions that sounded great on paper, and then when you actually went to kind of prove it out, it was like, oh yeah, this is definitely not going to work? And how that compares to maybe the more modern approach that is taking advantage of analytics and behavior, things like that, as well as the biometric components.
Yeah, I think that what we've seen globally is this, that regionally, where people are comfortable with things like biometrics, our biggest markets are in the Asian markets, where they've been using successfully and are very comfortable using biometrics. We just gave it a better, secure way to deploy it, a plug and play way for literally thousands of devices and endpoints to plug and play. In China, in Japan, large scale banks, large telcos, all of them about bettering their service protocol. And we've seen that paying huge dividends when people are now under COVID in those areas of the world where they're having to shelter in place and they can't go to a local bank. They don't have the physical structure anymore. So in those regional areas, that was one big benefit. In other areas of the world, there's roughly, of the world's population, somewhere between 3 and 4 billion people that don't know what a password is. So let's not tell them. Okay, let's not go redig the hole we've been in for a while from a IAM standpoint. Do we have a convenience now that you can say, like I said, somebody like if you go to the FIDOalliance.org website and you look at a number of the use cases that they're now publishing? Well, we started on the passwordless journey back with NTT Docomo and replacing large-scale usernames and passwords for literally hundreds of devices and thousands of applications using biometrics, secure PIN, other conveniences, behavioral biometrics. And the idea behind that was, could we make better business for them? Could we eliminate cost and actually, in many cases, give them new lines of business they could use? Think about the paradigm shift of security being just a cost function. Better security actually leading to more profitability from a user base on goods and services you can get them to use quickly and easily. That's the transformation we've seen. So if you look at the Intuit piece, what they talk about, you look at the Docomo piece that's on the website, those case studies are starting to illuminate to a lot of large scale users, in some cases, tens of millions of users of our installs, how this kind of simple protocol can change the way you look at your business profiles.
One of the things that you just brought to my mind comes around this concept of strong authentication. And I don't know if there's actually kind of an industry defined definition of what that means, because it seems to have different definitions based on who you talk to, or maybe, the vendor or the use cases. How do you define that? Does that make sense? Or is there a way to standardize on that, or is it really going to have to be kind of fragmented the way it is now?
Well, I think that one of the challenges for any standardization is the amount of fragmentation. If you look at the fragmentation in the highly regulated industries or the payment industry inside the fintech banking industries, those levels of fragmentation, the regional nature of essentially compliance that they have to comply to, the risk assurance scoring they have to supply, all of that goes back to a construct that says, okay, those are things we've lived with for a long time, but we've band-aided them. Can we use the existing systems today to add in something that maybe end runs that maybe changes that paradigm? Just like when Senate Bill 1386 was cost of a data breach that Larry Poneman started to study in the Poneman Institute that IBM now owns and published. Cost of a data breach, been around a long time now. We didn't know when we started saying, hey, we've got laws being put in place that if you breach people's data, that's a bad thing, and we're going to fine you for it. GDPR, we're going to fine you big time for it. What is the cost of those things? Well, Larry went and studied that and put out the first metrics. And they surprised a lot of people. It didn't surprise people that you had to solve for the notification problems of the people affected, or you had to announce it. They didn't realize that when you announced a bad data breach, it was going to kill your stock price in the public markets. It was going to cause large churn in businesses that never had churn. And it started to set up a baseline, to your point, of what is the cost. I would promulgate to your users today, or to your listeners, excuse me, and their users, what is the cost of failed authentication? What is the cost of only worrying about one segment of your customer base, maybe your employees, not your partners nor your consumers, when it comes to failed auth? I would promulgate today that authentication and identity, when it fails, is no longer a security issue or a usability issue. It's become a system level issue, and it's going to affect your bottom line, just like a data breach does. And I don't think we've ever looked at it that. And one of the things I hope to do in the coming year is work with some people and some big industry partners like we did to do FIDO to try to normalize and really answer that question. What is failed authentication? What is failed identity costing you when it doesn't work?
Hey, Phil, I think I'm going to borrow one of your quotes that you said. There are 3 to 4 billion people who don't know what a password is. Let's not tell them. I love that. It kind of leads me to the follow-up that there are many more devices that will come online. Let's not tell them what a password is. So kind of that whole idea around the Internet of Things and identity of things. Shifting gears, you spent your career improving the way we authenticate the systems, but now there are machines authenticating. What are some of the challenges with this paradigm, and maybe some real world use cases that you've been working on?
Yeah, I think that those paradigm shifts are really reflecting how we want the real world to continue to work. So things that computers are good at is automating things. How do we do a better job of automation? And there's a number of those that we've worked on. Some of them like a shop floor where you're wearing gloves, you're wearing a mask, you're wearing a vest. How do we make maybe the vest be your identifier so it opens doors for you? It can turn on and off equipment when you're near it from a location standpoint. How we authenticate and identify you as a real user. So maybe you entered the building, put on the vest and your phone in your pocket, talk to each other and say, hey, it's Phil Dunkelberger, and Phil has these authority to do these things on the shop floor. And after that, I never have to key anything into a device or a machine controller. It does it automatically for me. Those are some of the simple things we've already built and done using the idea of IoT, machine to machine auth. In fact, our whole build at Nok Nok was about looking at scale, because when you're talking about authentication, you tend not to talk about it in terms of scale, yet it's all about scale. And that's where we started, because today machine to machine auth is what machines do. How can we enhance that for better usability? Let's look at a thing like driverless vehicles, right? How do I authenticate that the driver or the operator in the Nok controlling the vehicle is really who they say they are? And that's what I call the overlap of man and machine that we're always going to have. So we've introduced a bunch of things from our technology stack standpoint in a recent announcement we had that talks about what do you do with the human terminal interfaces in IoT? Because let's say you've got the right person operating the car out in the street and it's got a load of passengers in it and it's driverless and it gets a flat tire. Well, is the convenience going to be the guy in the car goes in the back and changes his or her own tire? Probably not. Probably a service person is going to come up and fix that for you. Back to man to machine, IoT, now having broken, some human's going to have to intervene in the break. But we also want to know from a security and IAM standpoint that security person that is fixing that vehicle or tampering with it at all is an authorized service person, because the liability in this new idea is huge and the risk is big. So you're going to want the signaling coming from that remote capability, that remote car, that remote user, that remote fixer. You're going to want strong authentication, because you got big risk if it's not. Repairs are bad, faulty, they do something untoward to that device. So different way of looking at auth and IAM, but I see IAM and identity as being the linchpin of the future of both. IoT, and then the cool kinds of applications you're going to be able to build around those things.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some interesting applications that are coming out of that. And it brings me to think about what Google is doing with their Project Jacquard, which is, basically IoT clothes. So when you were talking about the vest and, you put it on, it knows who you are, what are the other things that it can do? I think they just put out a backpack with, in partnership in Samsonite, where there's like a touch panel on one of the shoulder straps that you swipe it in different directions and it's, pairs up with your phone immediately and does different things, changes the music or, does whatever. And I see a lot of interaction, obviously, between the devices. And as the technology becomes smaller, more miniaturized, right, there's just going to be more and more of these little IoT things that need to talk to each other and need to be, secure. And I like what you said about the people who don't know about a password, because we've been hearing that the password has been dead since 2004. I think Bill Gates declared the password was dead, and yet here we are, 2020, and it's still alive and well and everywhere. What do you see as far as truly, the password dying? Are we still several years out, which is kind of where I think it personally is, or are we closer than that?
No, I think that it's several years out regionally. I think we're seeing big strides in places that are comfortable using things like biometrics. We've seen usability in the banks that we've put it in, usability in the telcos we put it in, usability in the insurance purchase, all cadres of business that are using it, the medical groups that are now using it. All of these things are readily adoptable if there is value. I would say to all of my friends, we've been doing passwordless, frictionless, eliminating account takeover, credential stuffing, phishing. We've been doing that for more than 5 years with the protocol and our architecture. And we had a leg up because we wrote the protocol. So we did cool things with it. But like everything, you find your customers are far more inventive than you ever are when you give them something new in their environment. And I see different industries moving at different speeds, but the real key is going to be the so what. You alleged earlier that, hey, the security teams, the IAM teams, the risk assurance teams come to the rest of the business people around the table and the business teams and have to sell why they should, put it in, why they should change. We've seen that in spades, what I call the people around the table and the door they enter you through, what their perspective is. And what I'm seeing is, so you got passwordless, frictionless, so what? The real key is going to be for adoption and removal of things that work. Usernames and passwords are a pain, but they work and people know how to use them. And we have help desks, resets, and everything all set up around them. To get that to change is when you can go in and say, we eliminate password reset. One of our telcos, 81% of their help desk calls were password resets. And that's a substantial chunk of their budget. We've eliminated that for the users of our particular system and install there. That's a lot of money. That was easy to get the head of engineering in that company to pay for it. I think we need, back to your point, a standard way of measuring it. Where can IAM really measure, not just inside the firewall traditionally for enterprise users, but broadly? Where can we use existing systems today and upgrade them? And how can we do it in a sequence that is done where you don't have to do it all at once? You can replace systems as you go. And that's the beauty of what we've been trying to do. But it's also integrating all the other new tech that's out there. NEMI bracelets for your heartbeat, right? That's a cool thing. A ring. You've got iVein and things that are better than just scanning the eye for false positives in this area. How do we onboard people with things like Jumio and Onfido? And, these are really good ideas of blending these things and making the automation of auth across systems a system level solve, not just an auth or an identity solve. And how do we do it without customizing the hell out of it? So we spend more time on services than we do on just plopping a product in and making it work as a solution.
How far is too far when it comes to biometrics, right? There's a lot of different options you just mentioned. And, I think people may get concerned with, can this, how much of my biometric data is out there? Can it be manipulated? Is there a possibility to reuse it through deep fakes, which is kind of like the thing right now, right? Um, what would you tell people that had these opportunities to potentially go, passwordless, no password, whatever we want to take it, but it's going to require some sacrifice of either personal data, biometric data, those sorts of things. And how do we assure people that their data is being kept secure and not being misused?
Well, I think you've touched on like 500 different things there with that question, starting with the ethical use of people's identities and what they can do with them. What does it do? What does a sovereign identity really mean to people? That it's really yours and you control it, which we don't control our identities today on almost anything we do. Uh, my device level stuff is mapped by everybody. That's how they feed me information, et cetera. So, what is identity and what is it in it's today and what can be used? Biometrics can be one part of the solution. One of the things about what the key to FIDO is FIDO doesn't store your biometrics or your templates. It creates based on your swiping, touching, selfies, voice. It creates essentially a public-private key pair. Public key pair on the server side, private key pair on your device. And you build key rings as you surf the web, essentially. It's the old parlance of encryption. But it's based on strong encryption and challenges. It's based on a back off that if it doesn't like the signal it's getting from that encryption pair, you can reset it by reswiping your finger. You can challenge it out of band. You can device bless by two different devices that you have. It gives you flexibility. Now, like anything else, I would argue that we've looked at this thing through the wrong lens for a long time, back to thinking differently. What you want is the strongest signals you can get from a device and a human or device to device to make a business call on, right? To let your authorizations go into play. The really interesting piece on that is if we change the paradigm to risk assurance and really focus on assurance signals, not risk signals that we're getting, noise in the machine, we have a much better chance of, when we go into a zoo, we know where all the animals are. They're all labeled. It's nice to see them. We're pretty safe. You go into the jungle, you don't know, back to my conservation days, you don't know what's around the next bend. And that's kind of what we're dealing with in this area of COVID. I don't have a building to go to anymore where I've got all kinds of protections built in to my algorithm. I'm at home. I'm working on stuff that wasn't designed to be enterprise class anymore. And you look at that and you say, then we've got to build conveniences that fit that model at scale too. So zoo versus the jungle. How do we know we're going to be safe in the jungle? Just like I am at home using these devices and things, goes right back to that core question. What is it you're willing to risk to do better business differently in this new age versus protecting or being under the European Banking Authority or, BITS or any of the things in the United States or the NIST recommendations? What are you going to be able to do to thread that needle to better where we are today versus sticking with 50-year-old technologies?
Hey, Phil, you've been super generous with your time today, and I'd like to maybe shift the conversation a little bit away from the IAM piece and talk a little bit about what it is that makes up the special recipe of Phil Dunkelberger, and what are you doing to sort of sharpen the saw, as I like to put it, to be a better professional, technology leader. You're a CEO, a leader of people. You're an entrepreneur, a board member, and as a human, what are the things that you're doing that you might recommend to the next generation of leaders?
It's an interesting question. At my late age in my career of a 40-year career in tech, and I go back to the basics. I go back to one of my heroes in life was John Wooden, the great coach at UCLA that coached basketball. And Wooden was all about the basics. How do you put your socks on? I mean, started with that every year. And I look at the basics that are out there today, and I go back to that a lot. I remember one of the books that changed my thinking dramatically, talking about this whole theme of thinking differently about the problems we're all facing today in IAM. It's a whack on the side of the head. How do I get more creative than more word bound? Van Eck's book. How do the great book of Carlos Castaneda, Don Juan, A Yaqui Way of Knowledge, sociology book, that said to become a man or a woman of knowledge, we got to forget what we know. You know, I ask myself sometimes in a day how many times I said, I don't know, because when I say those three words, they might be the most empowering words in the English language. I don't know. Because most of the time we're expected, especially as the CEO, you're supposed to know everything. And I'm at my best when I don't know. I'm at my best when I'm thinking differently. And I've just found that, gosh, people who know everything usually don't have their minds open to learning anything. And if I can stay in that I don't know mode and reflect on it, I find I'm open to learning. And by doing that, I reach out to a lot of people and talk to them about how they're solving problems. I'm blessed with a lot of people over a 40-year career that I look to that mentor me still. I've lost some at my age. I've lost the great Howard Bain, who is the CFO at Symantec, and Max Hopper, who I've already talked about on the call, the great MIS person from both American Airlines and Bank of America, multi-time board member. I've been really blessed in my life with these kind of people that have challenged me to think differently and to keep being a lifelong learner.
You've had a full plate of different things that you serve on. Are there any, especially when it comes to, you know, the opportunity to be part of, you know, boards for different groups, et cetera, if there's one takeaway that you could take away from serving as a board member, what would it be?
It would probably be that one size doesn't fit all, but it might fit something of value. And I think that the experience base I've been able to collect over the years, when I'm looking at being on the board of trustees of Westmont College and them opening the college up in COVID, and the challenges from an IT and learning perspective, and all the tech that goes into that, plus a bunch of other things, human interaction. And I'm on the board of a startup called My Pin Pad, doing pin on glass, this whole new part of, you know, what people want to do, the back end pin and what you can do on glass and how that will affect the world. Not all things apply in both areas, but some of the experiences I've been able to have and some of the lessons life has taught me is applicable in both, not just in the tech world.
Wise words. I'm glad you brought that up, because this, you know, the COVID pandemic has hit a lot of different areas, and to hear from, you know, yourself and how you approach it from that perspective is, you know, good information, I think, for people to pick up on. I know that you've been, you know, as Jim mentioned, you know, very generous with your time. And before we let you go, are there any other words of wisdoms or other superlatives that you want to throw out there that our listeners can pick up?
I think for the practitioners out there, more and more people are going to be having to do things differently. It's one of the things that we've learned, that we weren't really set up to be a mobile, remote workforce, both locally and globally. Whole industries are being dynamically changed before us. Some will be able to return it somewhat, but they're going to depend on people who are really looking at those issues and not settling for the conveniences we've had. I was on a podcast recently where a good friend of mine asked me, he said, you know, Dunk, a lot of the security people, a lot of the people in identity, a lot of people in cloud, a lot of people looking at IoT and Bitcoin, you know, conveniences and things that are coming, new currencies. He said, what do you think? And I said, this disintermediation, as Max Hopper taught me on my board, is really an opportunity to move things forward. And if you think back even 20 years, as we were reminiscing earlier, you know, 10 years ago, wireless, you had to go get a dongle and plug it into your laptop. You know, that wireless wasn't everywhere. And now with 5G, it changes that paradigm again. You know, 5G lives up to its promise, which I've seen it in places that have done it right. You're going to be able to get, you know, what we consider Wi-Fi speed walking around with your phone. How does that change the application space? How does that create new business opportunities for you? And I would say that right now I see the world driving 90 miles an hour, looking out a rear view mirror. It's one of my favorite images in my head. And to the practitioners on the phone, you guys have led a lot of the changes and you've done a magnificent job. And you work in an area where you can be right 1,000 times and wrong only once, and then get nailed for being wrong 1 time out of 1,001. And I would say to you that what got us here was taking some risk and convincing the people to go along. learning to talk in business terms and getting the people in the business to see what we're doing can really change. And as one of my guys said at one of the largest banks, top 10 bank in the world, said to me, 50% of my customers will never enter a bank branch in the coming 5 years. Half of all of my customers will never again cross the threshold of one of my branches, because banking without walls is really going to be the future. Wow. There's an industry that's changing. Digital transformation. It's changing, and the leadership in many cases is going to be identity and access will be part of the new perimeter. And I praise you guys for what you're doing and trying to bring this message to people. And I hope the people that listen today find some value in thinking differently going forward about it as fast as they can.
Thanks, Phil. I really appreciate that. And before we close out here, Jim, are there any final things you want to toss out there for the group?
Yeah, I mean, we always, Jeff, make the offer to our listeners to connect to us on LinkedIn. Anyone who's listening who's interested in networking with Jeff or I, please send a LinkedIn connection. Phil, are you also open to networking with folks in the industry? And what is the best way for people to go about linking up with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is a great platform. I look at the request always. I try to, at least. I think we're all busy and inundated, but if people out there want to know more about what we're doing or what I've been doing, I'm always open to that. Through the company website, people can get a hold of me at, dunk@nok.com. That's my email address. If they want to know more about FIDO, go to the FIDOalliance.org as a protocol. I encourage everybody to learn more about that, as it's being put in every browser and will be widely available at an endpoint at a browser new year in 21. And the last piece is just if I can be helpful in the future to people through you guys let me know, and I'll be glad to pitch in where I can.
Well, we certainly love to have you back at any point, even if it's just a conversation around, the topic of conservation and trying to help out there. It's a shame we didn't record that part. We were kind of getting everybody because it was really fascinating, but maybe we'll save that for another time. And we'll definitely have links to a whole bunch of different stuff in the show notes for this. So definitely want to check that out. We'll have a link to Phil on LinkedIn. We'll have a link to Nok Nok. They've also got a good blog they've put together, especially around with October being Information Security Awareness Month. And trying to think what else, FIDO Alliance and Game Rangers Association of Africa. So really a smorgasbord of different things that people can check out through the show notes. Phil, thanks so much for joining us. Jim, another great one. You can see why I was so pumped to have this conversation today. I have no idea what we're going to call this episode because we were kind of like all over the place. So we'll have to figure that out. Phil, any ideas on kind of what we should call this episode from a title?
Yeah, I probably, as we talk through this, gentlemen, it's been a privilege to be here. And what I would say to that is the title should probably be something about, something along the lines of identity and access management, wither its future.
I think that sounds good. And maybe next time we'll be able to get Peanut to speak up and give her thoughts on the state of authentication in the world. So with that, we're going to go ahead and close it out for this episode. And appreciate it, Phil. Appreciate it, Jim. Appreciate it, everyone who's listening. And we'll talk with everyone in the next one. You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. For more episodes, visit identityatthecenter.com.